A social distancing tip.
While the CDC urges you to avoid close contact, like hugging or shaking hands, there are other non-physical ways to say hello. Wave, wink, use sign language, salute, smile, give the peace sign, throw up an air high five, do jazz hands. Remember, stay a minimum of 6 feet or 2 arms length away from others and stay home if you can. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
With the Super Bowl in the rearview mirror by a matter of days, there's more pro football in February. Get ready for it. The XFL starts today, and with it, a new era where it's always football season. The home team, the DC Defenders, they want to set the tone from the opening kick. Meanwhile, the underdog visitors from Seattle, they are all business.
Seattle Dragons. Run this time. Run this time. Break out of the other team, but let's hit him in the face. Let's go.
Minutes away from the kick, the energy, anticipation, and excitement builds. All for the love of football. This is the XFL on ABC. 43 degrees. The sun has come out. Audi Stadium in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Welcome to the progressive countdown to kickoff for the XFL opener. And you know, when the Seattle Dragons, the DC Defenders get together, you can throw out the records. There are no records. It's a clean slate. If all you know about the XFL is he hate me, forget about it. Long gone. This is the brand spanking new XFL. Great to be with Greg McElroy. I'm Steve Levy. Right here today, you're going to see the passion of football players who are going for a few things. Go to the NFL, get back to the NFL, and if not, just playing football really for the love of football itself. This is win-win for everybody.
It's great. I mean, football is America. America is football. I mean, it is synonymous with the fabric of our country, and we have 10 more weeks of it. It's going to be incredible. I can't believe we're here. We finally made it, but football is here to stay. Thank goodness for the next several weeks.
You're going to be at your best today because in 100 years from now, we're celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the XFL. This is the tape or whatever it's going to be at that point. They're going to plug in.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Oh, yes, we did. How you doing, everybody? It's your doctor of defunct, your evocateur of expansion, your professor of previously domiciled, your reverend of relocation, your captain of contraction. Yes, it's your buddy, Tim Hanlon. And this is indeed Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast, our little journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for coming by. Thank you for allowing us to distract you from all the ills of the world outside. As we hunker down still and do all the right things to stay safe and healthy. Hopefully you and yours are doing exactly that. And of course, as is the wont on this show, we don't wait around too long. We don't waste any time, frankly. When things go kablooey in the realm of pro sports, we tackle literally and figuratively the situation. And we don't wait around for the body to be, frankly, cold. We dip right into the situation at hand. And this week, as you just heard there, we're going to get into it. The XFL, the second version of such, already come and gone for various reasons. Well, obviously, the most pronounced of them, of course, is this incredible turn of events that all of us have gone through the last couple of months. But perhaps very dramatically, the XFL with, all of the storm and drang of Vince McMahon and the braggadocio and the money and the commitment to at least a 3 or 4 year game plan is kaput, is gone, is done, and dramatically so in very short order a couple of weeks back. And I think shocking, not too, obviously a surprise and maybe not too surprising in the face of all the bad news and potentially further maladies and stories yet to come. The questions around how pro football, pro sports, large events, all those kinds of things, the uncertainty of that for sure. I think a lot of people certainly had didn't sort of feel too surprised that the XFL was going to take a pause, just like all of pro sports. But I think a lot of people were just shocked, frankly, just how quickly the end of it basically was just announced over a span of just literally just a couple of days. We're going to get into the dramatic turn of events, as well as the lead up and sort of what was sort of planned to come and maybe sort of what is yet still to play out around the XFL, the second version of such, with our guest this week, Kevin Seifert. And if you haven't read his stuff on ESPN.com or the ESPN app, Kevin is the premier NFL and pro football writer for ESPN. And we're going to get into a bunch of his following of this league. He was amongst the first to break the news that there would be both a suspension of the league as well as the reporting of the fact of its declaration, Alpha Sports, the unit set up by Vince McMahon to fund and run this league, declaring bankruptcy shortly thereafter, literally one business day after announcing that the league would suspend operations. But Kevin, obviously, excellent writer around all things pro football generally, but also a bunch of stories that we'll get into about the XFL, its birth, some of the interesting stories and players that were part of the mix, as well as obviously intrepidly reporting its very quick, at least initially, demise. We get into all bunches of things, how Vince McMahon funded the whole enterprise via his Alpha Enterprises, the business plan, the TV rights, essentially doing TV buys and on the bet that over time, a couple of years maybe, that the roles could get reversed and then some rights fees could be paid to the XFL, the running of games on Fox and ESPN and ABC and FS1 and that clip that you just heard, was indeed from the very first game that was on ABC. Steve Levy calling the action with Greg McElroy, the color commentary, and that was February 8th, literally just almost 3 months ago as we record this episode at Audi Stadium in D.C., the home of D.C. United, the Major League Soccer team. Just about a sellout crowd there, almost 20,000. Arguably a right-sized environment for a fledgling and still unproven at the time football league. The DC Defenders, the home team, against the Seattle Dragons, already in their first game without any other games played. The underdog, the Seattle Dragons were. We're going to get into all of the curious stories around all of that, why it was so quick to shut down and then declare bankruptcy literally a day later. Why not perhaps just suspend operations and try to come back in the spring of next year? Look, the NFL isn't even figured out what they're going to do for this fall. Is college football going to come back? We have a whole bunch of leagues still as we record this, still not certain if they're going to complete seasons and all that kind of stuff. So it seems perhaps to some a very hasty decision to just cut bait and end the whole thing right there and declare bankruptcy. The manner in which all of it was shut down, some have already argued if COVID-19 was a convenient excuse to end this thing, perhaps maybe as it was already getting going, that Vince maybe didn't see actually this playing out 2 to 3 years according to plan, and the McKinsey research that sort of foundationally got this all set up to go. What is the state of Oliver Luck, who was arguably what I would call the chief credibility officer? I mean, he was, obviously the big name with a tremendous football pedigree, and now is embroiled in a lawsuit against, interestingly, not Alpha itself, but Vince McMahon personally, since he is and was the source of the money. And the manner in which Luck was let go, was terminated before even the announcement of the league suspending operations and then declaring bankruptcy. So hijinks probably yet to play out there. What of Vince's legacy now? I mean, this is arguably strike two. Do you want to mix a metaphor? His second attempt at professional football. We all know how the first one played out, but obviously for different reasons. And we alluded that some of that, and we obviously had some previous conversations devoted to that. Just search up all the past episodes on goodseatsstillavailable.com or your podcast catcher. You'll find those episodes. And maybe, too, also the idea of spring football or playing pro football or some version of pro football in the spring, or even just a challenger league at that. As Kevin sort of wisely points out, the AFL, probably the last sort of successful challenger / merger into constituting a lot of what the NFL is today. But ever since then, right, it's just been folly after folly and mishap after mishap in terms of trying to create either an alternative or a challenger or some combination thereof to the mighty NFL. So we get into all of those aspects of the conversation, albeit only a few months after its demise and its actual launch, frankly. And it's our first investigation of what happened to the XFL 2.0 with our guest this week, Kevin Seifert from ESPN and ESPN.com. And stay tuned for that. You will learn a few tidbits already. And stick around for that. Before we do so, however, we want to say greetings to our old pals at oldschoolshirts.com in Cincinnati, Ohio. Beautiful Cincinnati, Ohio. And it's a wonderful site. It's a wonderful set of garb that they have for you at oldschoolshirts.com, one of our longest lasting sponsors. We cannot thank them enough. And if you consider yourself to be an old soul trapped in a modern world, well, you can relive those days gone by with classic imprints from the vast collection at our friends at oldschoolshirts.com. They're passionate about vintage style shirts and the teams and the brands, the places that inspired them. They've got a wide assortment of stuff, designs, logos from not only sports teams and leagues, but also other pop culture places that you may remember, literally and figuratively. Perhaps that ice cream stand that was famous in your city, or an old radio station that you grew up with, maybe even a stadium or an arena that brought back lots of memories, maybe still around, frankly. All of those things and many, many more are commemorated in classic and well-constructed t-shirt form at oldschoolshirts.com. And of course, when you go there and you visit early and often and you purchase a couple of those items, and you're going to love them, I'm sure you will, make sure that you use the promo code at checkout, will you? It's Good Seats. Yeah, use that promo code Good Seats at checkout. And please enjoy, courtesy of P.F. Wilson and friends at oldschoolshirts.com and us here at Good Seats, still available, 10% off all of your purchases. Yes, that's the promo code Good Seats, all one word, 10% off all of your purchases at oldschoolshirts.com. We thank them, of course, for their sponsorship of the show, and we thank you for checking them out. And we thank you, of course, for continuing to listen as we now segue, nice and smooth, see, into our conversation about the second go-around of the XFL. What the hell happened? It was in a blink of an eye, it's gone. And here's our conversation with ESPN's Kevin Seifert coming at you. Please, as always, enjoy. The idea around this silly little show, right, is focused on what used to be in pro sports. And, frankly, we don't wait for bodies to be fully cold and ready for burial around here. Because, and here's, this is almost reminiscent of the AAF. But just a quick background for our audience. You are the NFL, but also, I guess, more broadly, the Pro Football scribe for a bunch of stuff at ESPN, yeah?
Yeah. I think, we almost, well, I wouldn't say exclusively, but very frequently writing NFL stuff, but I'm interested in all levels of pro football. So I've done CFL work. I've done XFL, a little bit of AAF. I've worked on stories relating to the Spring League, which is sort of a developmental league that's based in Texas. And so all kinds of football avenues for me.
Well, yeah, and you've written a bunch of very straightforward and frankly, news-breaking articles about the XFL. But maybe before we get into some of that, give me a sense of what your perception of the XFL version 2.0, of course, was when Vince magically showed up in that studio in Stamford, Connecticut, with that video press conference announcing the return of this shall we say, very tarnished brand from 10 years earlier.
Yeah, I was surprised and maybe a little skeptical. There has, and there still has, never been a successful alternative pro football league really since the AFL, which eventually merged with the NFL in 1970, and that's where we have the modern NFL from now. And so since then, there have been many people who have tried to essentially cash in on the NFL success, to sort of bleed into the really high profile level of pro football and college football in this country. But it had never been successful. And so I was really surprised because I didn't know where the path to success was. He made clear he didn't want to be a developmental league for the NFL, which some people have said is something that could possibly work. That he wanted to have as not necessarily a competitive league, but with the NFL, but certainly one that was independent. And so I think my first reaction was probably skepticism. And when he talked about a 2 or 3 year ramp up process, I wondered if it would ever come to fruition.
Well, and how did you also square that with, and I apologize for not remembering the exact timeline, but the arrival and the announcement of the AAF as well. And of course, for anybody who's not seen, this is the XFL and the Charlie Ebersol 30 for 30, and obviously Charlie's starting of the AAF, which is its own semi-comical and disastrous story in and of itself. Not related, but sort of related, right? Because in essence, you have to put this in framework, right? This is the second or one of two announcements of a new football league in the spring, albeit in 2 separate years.
Yeah, and the AAF felt very pressured / motivated to debut, to get ahead of the XFL. They thought that they would never have a chance if the XFL got on the field first, and that their only chance was to get out there and start building their brand and acquiring players and that sort of thing before the XFL did. And so that's part of the reason they failed, was they just, it's really hard to build a football league regardless. And on their really rushed time table, they weren't able to line up the financing. They weren't able to get their business side in order. They actually had a decent football product, but the business side is what ultimately crashed that league. And a lot of that was because they were really rushed to try to get on the field before the XFL started.
Well, aside from the bravado and the bucks, right, in Vince McMahon's favor, right, from a pro football reporter perspective, right, you really now have two sort of challenger leagues, not only coming out of nowhere, right, and arguably, I guess framing, you could sort of say, where there once were none, now there are two, and how likely are each of them or both of them to succeed. But then you juxtapose that against what you said in the earlier part of this discussion, right? This sort of long litany of, generally either directly or indirectly competitive, right? Pro leagues of some ilk or sort, and a bunch of them trying to fill this void in the spring. So what's going through your mind as an eagle-eyed reporter, trying to be objective, maybe a little bit optimistic, but it just seems like there's a bigger circus of folly beyond just Vince McMahon and the XFL.
Yeah, I mean, I got the idea of why, if something is really successful and seems to be continuing to grow, which is what the NFL was in terms of revenues every year, it seemed like they were adding another $1 billion to their total revenues, and they had really shot up to the top of the list in terms of pro sports in this country. Sports gambling was becoming a big, around that time we were just starting to realize that sports gambling was going to be a really strong revenue producer at some point for pro sports, and certainly football lent itself well to that from the fantasy perspective and just straight up gambling. And so you could see why there would be interest. You have the money making and also just the interest level around the country in the game, but you still, whether it was mysterious financial backers of the AAF or the obvious financial backer of the XFL and Vince McMahon, you still didn't know how they could succeed, because the NFL was just celebrated its 100th year. It took a long time for them to build themselves up into what they are, and football is a very expensive sport to play, and to pay players, pay insurance, pay workers' comp, lease stadiums, all the things that go into, starting a league from scratch. The NFL has such a long head start on. So in my mind, again, I just questioned where the financial path to success was. And I knew neither one of these leagues was doing this for charity or for fun. You know, you don't spend that kind of money or commit that kind of money just to have fun and be able to watch football. They presumably thought there was a path to financial success. And that's probably what I questioned, is what was that path and how would that really work?
So when the details start to sort of come out for this XFL thing, and Vince sort of puts some specifics around it, announces Oliver Luck, obviously, we'll talk about him in a second. Give me a sense of did you think that, well, obviously he made a distance from the first version of the XFL for various reasons. But what struck me, I guess, as an interesting salvo was the choice of markets, right? 7 of the 8 markets for the XFL were in NFL cities, albeit in mostly different stadiums, a couple shared, versus the AAF approach, which seems very, I guess, classically challenger with underserved markets such as the Jacksonvilles and the Birminghams of the world.
Yeah, I understood that part because
Orlando, excuse me, not Jacksonville. I apologize.
Yeah,
Jacksonville on my mind because Jacksonville's clearly always been in the WFL, and I get the Florida say, but you don't get what I'm going.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely got the idea of using those markets because the XFL's whole basis was that they had hired a consulting firm to do market research, and the research packet came back saying there was 35 million to 40 million hardcore football fans in this country who, when the NFL Super Bowl was over, were just pining for more football. They're in mourning because, and we all know people like that, and sometimes I've been that way. They're just mourning that second weekend in February when there's nothing, there's no football on now, and there's not going to be any for a long, long time. And so they felt like that was evidence and that was their target market. And so you might find those people in the markets you talked about from AAF, but you probably were more likely to find them in cities that were already, NFL cities and already sort of in that mode. And so I understood that their choice of markets in that regard, the more people that live up, and the other part is just math. I think the more people that live in those markets, the better chance you are of having people show up to a game. It's not going to be like college football where you have small college towns that 100,000 people come to because they've been doing that for years, and there's tradition and there's an expectation of what it's going to be like. You're not going to have that kind of crowd walk up to an XFL game. So it makes sense to have them in big cities and in places where pro football is already well established and successful and loved.
All right. Well, two-pronged questions here, or parallel questions. One sort of is on the product and the football side, right? That's where an Oliver Luck comes into play. And if anything that the AAF did right was at least, I think, to most people, they spent a lot of time and effort trying to make sure that the football was of good quality and tinkering with the right rules. And it seemed like the XFL was going to do the same, if not perhaps a little bit even more so.
Yeah, and there, when I think the very first press conference that Vince McMahon had is he said we were going to reimagine the game. And that made me wonder, well, in what direction are they going to reimagine it? Are they going to reimagine it towards, knocking people's heads off when they run across the middle, or is it going to be reimagined in some other way? And so when they hired Oliver Luck, I thought that was that's probably the best thing that they did in terms of getting, true credibility for being a serious football operation. And it told me that, they were going to think outside the box. They were going to, try to come up with some new ways of doing things, but it was going to be very much within the spirit of the game and the sensibilities of the game. Because that's, obviously Oliver Luck being a former NFL quarterback and an NCAA administrator and a college, Division I AD, they weren't going to have, suddenly have 13 people on each side or have 5 forward passes allowed on every play. And so that was a reassuring thing and also a really good sign for the credibility of the league in terms of the product they were going to try to create.
In your world of football contexts, were there any rules that you found either personally or amongst your amongst your tribe or your sources that was generally seen as fun and interesting and intriguing, and or similarly just head scratching and borderline folly?
Most of the NFL people watched that, and they picked out two big things. And one was the kickoff alignment. They really thought that was smart in terms of getting to the place where everyone wants to get to, which are actually getting returns without having people run 35 yards in a full sprint and bashing heads with each other. And so the kickoff was it looked a little odd, there's no doubt about it at the beginning, but it was very successful in achieving the goal that everyone wants, which is to stop having touchbacks and start having a lot more returns. So that caught the eye of a lot of NFL people, of a different way to think about the kickoff. And the other thing was that really, I think, it caught a lot of eyes in the NFL was the extra point situation. The XFL got rid of actually kicking an extra point, and they gave you options for 1, 2, or 5 points after 1, 2, or 3 points after a touchdown, depending on where you took the ball. And so that changed so much beyond just the decision of what you do at touch. It changed all the fourth quarter math that coaches have to think about, and they admitted that they took them a while to really get what they should be doing. That when you're down by, you're down by 9, that could be a 1-score game, and so you have to start thinking in a lot of different ways. So it created a whole different sense of how you should approach game management in the fourth quarter, and even before that, which was really fun. And the 1-point conversion was not nearly as easy as the extra point kicking, and so you saw a lot of odd scores, a lot of no overtime games. I don't think they had a single overtime game, if I'm not mistaken. And so really, those two things really caught the eye of NFL people, and it doesn't mean they're going to implement it right away, but I think it got some people thinking that, when they actually saw it happen in a competitive game, that it wasn't as wild or crazy or too far out of the realm of possibility to consider.
Well, how about on the business side of it? I guess there are two prongs to that. One is the approach to television, right? There's no pro league that's ever going to survive in this country that doesn't have some pathway to some kind of television roadmap, if you will. And it looks like, the starting point was going to be the proverbial time buy or resource sharing. We've seen that model on a number of different occasions over the years, but including your network of domicile, ESPN. Maybe you have some insider sort of knowledge or understanding of, number one, smart idea. Number two, based on the ESPN broadcasts that I saw in the ABC/ESPN co-branded telecasts, it didn't seem like ESPN kind of spared any expense. I mean, I think Steve Levy, for example, he opened up the show by saying, throw out the rule books, right? There are no rules. So it was clear that they were having fun, and it was, on the side, it seemed like there was no shortage of innovation and enthusiasm for the broadcasts.
No, and I think the XFL, number one, did a very important thing, which is, whatever the pathway was, they got themselves on national television for every game. Every game was either on ESPN, Fox, ESPN2, FS1, FS2, I think, ESPN2. So every game was available if you had cable, and that was huge. And there's no getting around that. Eventually, they would have had to go from a resource sharing situation to build, their content value enough that someone would pay them to broadcast their games. And that didn't happen in the first year. And not a surprise. It wasn't part of their business model. I don't think. You certainly have to, accept that it's really good just to get your games on TV the first year. But, to survive, I think everyone understood that they were eventually going to have to get to that point where TV networks were paying them to broadcast the games. But in the meantime, they really, in order to, I don't want to say to induce the TV networks to do that, but to in the spirit of cooperation, they said, "Hey, we're open to anything. If there's things that the networks want to try, we're open to it. We're an open book. We're going to give you access to whoever you want, whenever you want. If you want players as they walk off the field after a turnover, we'll get them to you. If you want to hear the play call over the intercom, we'll give you that. If you want to hear the replay people make their decisions, we'll give you that." And so it really gave the networks a chance to expand and grow and provide interesting content, because people tuning in the games, unless you're a really hardcore college football fan, you're not going to necessarily recognize every name of the player on the field. So you're not tuning in just to see how, at least the first week or two, PJ Walker is playing, or Cardale Jones. You're tuning in to see a TV show, and part of the show was giving you access that the NFL never would give you access to, getting insight and emotion that you would never experience otherwise. I keep going back to Matt McGloin, the New York quarterback, who really was having a bad game. I think it was in the second week, and he kind of he was muttering under his breath, and you could get a good sense of who he thought was responsible. And he and the coach had a little bit of a back and forth, and that was real stuff. And so it was great content. The XFL was, willing to do just about anything. And it was easy for them because they had no tradition otherwise. If you went to the NFL and you said, we'd like to get coaches' play calls broadcast, there's no chance that would happen. A, because they're probably much more serious and secretive about their play calls, and B, they've gone all these 100 years without ever having to broadcast that, and it's not something that's easily changed. But when you get in sort of on the ground floor and everything's open for discussion, you have a much better chance of that. And so I think that was sort of the XFL's approach there.
Well, you're knee deep in the NFL and pro football generally. What was your take on the first, the only number of weeks of play on the field? It seemed a little bit better maybe than what I saw at the AAF in its first couple of weeks.
Yeah, it was better. Like, I think some of the attention on the innovations overshadowed some of the uneven play. I spent a lot of time personally watching to see how the various rule changes would work, and how the quicker pace would work. And, because they had a 25-second game clock, and then they changed the way the end of the game would go, so that there would be a better chance, more time for a 2-minute drill to win a game. And so I focused on a lot of that stuff, and maybe some other people probably did too. And that overshadowed the fact that this was still a very new operation in terms of, all these teams were just getting familiar with each other. None of these people had ever played together or coached together before. And so the level of play was probably uneven. And a lot of it depended on whether your team had a healthy quarterback, and B, a good one. Houston was 5-0, and PJ Walker was their quarterback, and he was the best quarterback in the league. And I think he was the only guy who stayed healthy for all 5 weeks. And so that was a big reason why they played the best, and they had the best offense. There were some teams who sort of cycled through quarterbacks in New York. Matt McGloin was not as good as people had hoped. And their level of play suffered, and it was a struggle. And so there was definitely some games that didn't live up to the hype in terms of high scoring and fast pace, but they also were in the first 5 weeks of their existence. And so the most meaningful part of the story was never told, which was what trend would they end the season on? Would they get they were at the midpoint of the season, and would they start scoring more in the second half? Would they get things together? Would things fall apart? Who knows? But so we never got a chance to sort of complete that story. But I think that there were some games that were really fun to watch and some that weren't.
Yeah, another observation that I sort of have is the stadiums and the fans, right? So the two flavors, I think, to that. Number one, having been a big Major League Soccer fan over the years, the unique usage, I guess, of two MLS stadiums in Los Angeles and in D.C., even for the first game, which to me almost feels like a more sane and realistic, I guess, environment, right? Where you're not talking about the cavernous 70 to 80,000 seat, gladiator-sized stadiums, aside from maybe the MetLife thing in New York, which is a different issue, but a more intimate kind of 20 to 25,000 seat environment where even if you don't sell it out, it still feels like it's, got a hefty bunch of people there and good sound and action and probably closer to the field at that for fans.
Yeah, and I think it was market dependent in some ways too. The two biggest or the two best attendance cities they had were Seattle, and they played at CenturyLink, but they basically just sold the bottom. I think they get like 25, 30,000 people at their games, and they just sold the lower deck. And the same in St. Louis. They played in the old, I think it's called the Dome of St. Louis now, but it was the old TWA Dome where the Rams used to play, and they sold, mostly just the lower deck, and they were at the 25 to 30,000 range. And both of those environments were very good. There was plenty of, it looked good on TV. There was plenty of noise. I was at the first game in DC where they had, I think, 17 or almost 18,000 people in the 20,000 seat Audi Field, and that was a great environment. And if you'd had it at FedEx Field, it would have been a lousy environment. So in that market, it was the right place. It was the right thing to do to have it at MLS. In LA, I mean, it was at an MLS stadium, but I think were averaging like 13,000. They were like, might have been the lowest. Them in Tampa Bay might have been the lowest attendance rankings. And so even though they were playing in an MLS stadium in a huge city, they were not getting a lot of attendance. So it was really, there was a lot of variations in the markets. And the idea, it was a really good environment to have an almost full MLS stadium, like in Washington, or to have 25 to 30,000 people in the lower bowl in St. Louis and Seattle.
Yeah, and I obviously we will never know to sort of see how that plays out, but there are plenty of MLS stadiums that frankly wouldn't mind some extra tenants and generate some revenue that way, and it could be that was the other thing I was going to sort of bring up was you mentioned Seattle, of course, but I think indeed St. Louis, right? If there was any quote unquote most successful franchise, frankly, aside from being on the field, I'm talking about. It seemed like St. Louis was only growing. I think they were expecting, I thought I read somewhere they were expecting almost 50,000 for their next game had it occurred.
Yeah, they had opened up the upper deck, I think, for sales for their next home game that was never played. So I guess we don't know for sure how many people would have showed up, but that was kind of the perfect formula because they're an NFL city that had been abandoned. And they're understandably still very upset about that and sensitive about it. And so that franchise was able to tap in to that sensitivity and that desire to show that they really are a football town, and also to embrace a team that really wanted to be there. We know that for a long time the Rams didn't want to be there before they moved, and so there was a lot of bad feelings there and bad vibes there. And whereas the St. Louis XFL team really wanted to be there and they wanted to connect, and they found a community that was very willing to embrace them.
All right. Well, before we get to the sort of the denouement and the sort of collapse for various reasons, I do want to bring up a story that you wrote a couple of weeks back, which I think brings up a possible other, if it had more time to do it, hint perhaps of what, besides a business and television ratings and all that stuff, the XFL could have evolved into. And that was your story that you wrote about Kenny Robinson. Maybe you want to give our audience a sense of that story, because Kenny Robinson is a guy coming out of college who basically is, well, you tell the story. He basically eschewed college for the XFL instead to get to the NFL. Yeah.
Right. So when the XFL first sort of came online, Oliver Luck, who had been an NCAA executive and also a college AD, made clear that just because the NFL has a rule that you have to be 3 years out of high school to be eligible for the draft, but that's not like a law, or it's not an NCAA rule, it's an NFL rule, and the XFL would not be bound by that. So if the circumstances were right, the XFL would be happy to take a promising college player who had played, some time in college, but for whatever reason, hadn't gotten through the 3 years. And so wouldn't have been eligible for the NFL yet, but they would be happy to, host that player for a year in the XFL. And that only happened with one player, and that was Kenny Robinson in the first year. I think it would have been more of it later. But Kenny Robinson had been an all Big 12, all conference safety at West Virginia, real ball hawk, a lot of interceptions. He got thrown out of school after his second year because of an academic violation. And so his options at that point were to either transfer down to a lower division and play right away and maybe disappear off of the draft map for the following year, or transfer and, walk on probably, but have to sit out a year at another school. And so instead of waiting a year, and he didn't want to transfer down. So instead of waiting a year and then playing like the 2021 season, the 2020 season in college and entering the 2021 NFL draft, he decided to go to the XFL, play, an XFL season, use that as sort of his, final year tape. He would have to miss the combine. He wouldn't be eligible for the combine, but he thought, and the XFL encouraged it, that playing 10 games in a professional league would probably do a lot more for his NFL prospects than playing, sitting out and playing another Division I year following year. And so he did that. 2 interceptions in 5 games, playing for St. Louis, and then entered the draft. He didn't have as much tape as he would have hoped because they only played 5 of the 10 weeks, but he had enough, and he ended up being a day 3 pick of the, I believe it was the 5th round of the Carolina Panthers. And now he's got an NFL signing bonus. He, in addition to the salary he earned in the XFL, and now he's on track to make an NFL roster in 2020 instead of playing at another school in 2020 in college. And so he was sort of the first and now the only player to get around the rules that exist for college players as they feed into the NFL. And he was able to be paid a salary for one of the years that he otherwise would have been in college. And so that was something that a lot of people have talked about, for a long time. Would there ever be a way to service those type of players and get them into a pro league, get them, they could be paid legally, I guess is the best way to put it, as opposed to what might happen in college, but, and then still not have their draft or their path to the NFL disrupted anyway. And in his case, it was accelerated. And so I think they probably would have looked for more players like that in their second year, but as it turns out, Kenny Robinson will be the only one to have benefited from that process. How
did Robinson become the one, I guess, to be the first to do that? Because it seems like I'm getting the sense, and your reporting sort of said it, that McMahon didn't want to ruffle too many feathers too soon in that first year with this idea.
Yeah, he went to. I think the story from his perspective was that his mom had been diagnosed with cancer, and so he was very worried about supporting her. His trainer told him about the XFL and that it was holding sort of regional combines, and he went to one and met with Oliver Luck and those people, and they both got a good feel for each other. And so the XFL felt confident that he was at a player who was high enough ceiling to make it worth it and to use sort of as a test case. But I don't know if there was a ton of other people who pursued it. It wasn't like they were going to get Trevor Lawrence from Clemson to give up his year, his next 2 years and play in the XFL. Even from a financial standpoint, I'm not sure if that would have worked well for a guy like Trevor Lawrence, but players like a Kenny Robinson, certainly it did, but I'm not sure if their doors were being blown down by people trying to do that or not. It probably would have been a more popular and interesting option for people this year had the XFL continued, but I don't think, my understanding is right, that I know the XFL didn't want to do a bunch of those players right away. They wanted to see how it went, and I don't know how many really expressed interest either.
Well, it also brings up the question, and it seems there was friction in this idea, right? McMahon sort of, at least publicly, said that he didn't sort of envision this as being a feeder league or developmental league for the NFL.
Right.
in many respects, it's kind of that, right? It feels a little G League-ish or some of the an alternative to playing college, say for MLS and soccer or certainly baseball, right? Where you've truly parallel path. Right?
Yeah. And in this case, though, like you could make an objective argument that his talent and his potential made it a no-brainer. He was one of the more talented players in the league from the defensive side, and certainly had the most potential. Amongst most of them had the most NFL potential as well. So it wasn't like they were just kind of doing a charity case or they were just doing this. The benefit to the XFL is that the player is good enough that he raises the level of play for their league, even though they know he's eventually going to go to the NFL, then they still had a more talented player playing that position for that team than they otherwise would have.
Yeah. What would have been? Well, let's kind of speed it up to, not even a month ago now as we're recording this. So on April 10th, the somewhat abrupt conference call by Jeffrey Pollack, the chief operating officer, which was a Friday. And then the Monday thereafter came sort of the falling of the second shoe to drop, which is the actual filing for bankruptcy of Alpha Sports and basically the proverbial nail in the coffin. So if you can remember that far back, obviously, the coronavirus issue is hitting pro sports and all kinds of ways of life, not just pro sports, in significant and unprecedented ways. But what was your take on this as these two events were playing out? Because I got the sense that there was kind of a little bit of an intrigue sort of hanging on that Friday call, but then Monday kind of closed the door on any potential hope. How did this play out in your mind?
Yeah, I was not expecting it, and I think most people who worked for the XFL were not expecting it. In the time heading into the season, that was the number one question: would the XFL get past its first year? Would it be another AAF? And my answer always was the big difference between the XFL and the AAF is that they had a real, honest to God, financier. We know Vince McMahon. We know who Vince McMahon is, and we know he has enough money to fund this. And if we didn't know that, we saw that he had sold hundreds of millions of dollars worth of WWE stock, of his own stock, to fund the company that was sort of the parent company for the XFL. So we knew the money existed. We didn't. The only hang up is that he could decide not to spend that money, just like any businessman. But there was every indication that he had gotten into it for the long haul for 2 or 3 years. And so even though, we were headed sort of into this unprecedented economic time and not being able to even finish out the season, and certainly not even being sure what would be the situation around the country in the following spring, I just, my own thought was that, there was enough money there in the bank to make this, and they had put too much work into building it up in the first place. Remember, they'd been in product development for 2 years after that announcement from Vince originally, before they launched, 2018 to 2020, and that it would seem to be a very quick pull if they had gone 5 games and then thrown in the towel after the COVID pandemic. And so I was surprised, certainly when the news came out that Friday morning, but in calling around the people from the XFL that were on the call, it was very clear to them that this was not a furlough situation. It was not a, we'll call you back once this is all over type of situation. They were all, based on the tone and the words used, convinced that the league was done that Friday, even though the league statement didn't say as much. And then that following Monday, the bankruptcy thing came, which seemed more of like a business, this was how they chose to liquidate the business, do the bankruptcy path. And so that part seemed a little anticlimactic. I was pretty certain that Friday, in the hours after the call, that the league, wasn't just suspended. It was done.
Were you surprised that perhaps it wouldn't just be suspended, say, for the year, and truly try to buy some time until next season, and you could still ramp down spending and people and personnel and stuff, and keep your options open, right, for another season if and when things might have normalized? No?
Yeah, that's sort of the unknown of the equation is really what their bottom line was. Not only how much money would that require, but also, and I think this part played into it a little bit, was the uncertainty that it wasn't just, we'll send everybody home here in April and we'll pull them back in December or so once, the world is back to normal, because that's when the training camps and all that would start for the 2021 season. Because there's no, Vince McMahon's like all the other business owners in the country. They have no idea what the world's going to be like in December. In the football world, we have no idea what's going to happen, to be honest, with the NFL season or the college football season. And if either one of those or both is delayed or pushed into the spring, then that would infringe on what the XFL's window was, and that could be disastrous for them as well. And so, Vince McMahon hasn't really spoken publicly about this, so we don't know entirely what his thinking is, and I'm not sure that a lot of people who work for the XFL or worked for the XFL know either. But it wasn't as if anyone could have had a firm grip on the timetable that would have been presented to them before they could get back to business. There was no guarantee whatsoever that they could step away for 8 months and then everything would go back to normal. And so that was probably part of the equation as well.
Well, and I know this is kind of for us at least, this silly little show, a hot take, right? But, as we record this the first week of May, college football is still, in a number of circles, still a viable proposition. Now, we'll see, right? The NFL, trimming their international games, but they're going through, they went through with the draft and they're going to be announcing their schedule in a couple of days, right? So at least they're going through the mechanics of normalcy. And again, we'll see, right? But it would, I don't know, as an outside fan with no inside understanding and or knowledge of McMahon or any of it, right? It as a fan and or as a curiosity interest, it seems like it wasn't not only premature, but a hasty and rash and very fast decision when arguably certain things were still not sort of fully, or at least more visibility about, say, other football leagues and all that stuff were maybe more known. We're still waiting for that. Yeah.
And, we don't know at this point how much money he'd put in or how much more money he would have to put in before he had the chance to get something out of it. But maybe when you add all the things we've talked about with the fact that it was still, even in a perfect situation, still not anywhere close to a guarantee that they were going to become profitable in the next couple of years. And then maybe you just say, well, maybe it's smart in this environment to cut your losses and not just keep spending money on it. And I know that's not what he wanted to do. He spent hundreds of millions of dollars just to get it to the point where it was. So that's not, pleasant by any means. And so, and it was probably, I think when he made the commitment initially, he probably knew that he was going to be spending a lot more than that to get it to where it was going to be. And so I can only assume that he decided it was better to cut losses, to minimize his exposure. Obviously the WWE is his primary business and focus on that. We may never know the full story there, but I don't think it was it might've been a quick decision, but I doubt that it was not based on some really hard numbers that he was faced with.
Oh, I'm sure. And it's not our money, right? So,
yeah.
But I guess as a fan and you believe us to a certain aspect and given all the time and all the resources to your point earlier, put against it, and the belief, right, that this was a worthwhile enterprise. I mean, it just seems, and again, it's not my dough, but it just seems like you're ending any potential opportunity for this to succeed later on somehow in some kind of delayed sort of fashion. I guess the real thing that and again, we may never know, would be really interesting to hear. I'm sure there are going to be fans And by the way, fans were really into this. I mean, it was, granted there might only be 18 or 20,000 people in the cavernous MetLife Stadium, but they seemed to be having fun. And I think there was clearly some goodwill being built up there. You got to think, though, that part of Vince, aside from the businessman and cutting losses, which is rational and understandable, and it's his money, there's a bit of sort of the tarnished legacy there, because he's had sort of two bites of the cherry, if you will, and two different, one very tart, shall we say, and one other more sweet, shall we say, in approach to football, to strain an analogy. And he's, kind of not been able to fulfill them in either case, right? So there's got to be a bittersweetness to this, albeit maybe for reasons beyond his control.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could probably look at the first iteration and maybe, I don't know what he would say to it, but the first iteration you could say definitely failed on its own accord. Probably, I mean, nothing is ever really this straightforward, but I think probably when history looks back on 2.0, though, the inescapable obituary will be that it was felled by the pandemic. And we can't say with 100% certainty, and probably Vince McMahon can't either, what he would have done after, if they had played the full season and there had absent any pandemic. Would he have gone to year 2? We think he would have. But again, when you have a one-person ownership structure and it's not, a group, there's no board of directors, there's no, buddy else really with any control there, you can't say for certain. So I think he to the extent that he's interested in doing it, I think he could reasonably and credibly say that 2.0 was a lot better, had a much better plan, a much better product, but ran into the surprise of one of the biggest economic and public health crisis in the history of the country, and joined many, many other businesses that were taken down with it.
All right, a couple of quickies to round out our conversation. I appreciate this. It's been great. Based on what you know the last couple of weeks, and to the extent that you're still trailing it, although obviously got this NFL thing to keep a tab on during, for the rest of your day job. What of Oliver Luck's lawsuit? What of the bankruptcy proceedings? Do you sense that somebody will scavenge for these assets, whatever they are? What do you think plays out in the next couple of months, if you have any sort of visibility into sort of how this whimpers down to a... Yeah,
I mean, there'll definitely need to be a resolution to Oliver Luck's lawsuit. He was terminated prior to the call where everyone else got laid off, and I'm sure he was the highest paid employee there, and so there's some significant dollars that would appear to be owed to him, and we haven't seen the response to the lawsuit from Vince McMahon's attorney, so we don't know what their sort of rejoinder to it is. But there's a lot of things that are redacted in Oliver Luck's lawsuit that if they weren't, would provide us some details into exactly what the dispute between the two of them are. But so that'll have to be resolved either through a settlement or through, open court. I would doubt either side really wants to go through open court, but we'll see. So that's something that has to be solved. And the XFL is officially for sale. I presume if anybody wanted to, buy the name and buy the whatever intellectual property that would be associated with it and sort of squat on it until there's a better economic opportunity to start the league again, and that's to be seen. But I don't expect I don't expect the XFL to return anytime soon, if ever, and I don't know if there'll be a similar or even close to similar attempt to create another league for quite some time.
All right. Well, so that sort of is my sort of last sort of big question, and I guess it's got a couple of components to it. One is there is that sort of long chain of challenger leagues, shall we say, not only in sports generally, but football specifically. And I guess the answer to that part is, over time, if there's any sort of whatever the new normal looks like over a period of time, certainly not in the near term, it just seems that history would just regenerate another group of people who would want to take another stab at the big dollars of a arguably still very, robust pro football marketplace. But, is it cursed, right? The idea of people don't necessarily do these things for business reasons, right? Egos and big boys and their toys and all that kind of stuff, right? So there's the elixir of football and owning pro sports and all that stuff. I mean, aside from the shortlist, let's call it short term. It's a couple of years, who knows? But who's to say that there won't be more people that come back to the well again and try again?
I mean, if history's a guide, then somebody will get the idea and that they're smarter than everybody else and that they can do it in a way that no one else has been able to do it before. My own, just from a very and I'm in no way a business reporter or have a very sharp business mind, but just the really unprecedented economic situation that the country is in and probably will be in for a while makes me think that it's just probably going to be the furthest thing from anybody who's capable of its mind to actually do it and do it in a way that would have a chance to make it anytime soon. But then we're in such an unprecedented time. We can't say that these type of economic downturns last X amount of time, because there's only been one or two of them in the history of the country. And so it could be years before we're even in a spot where somebody who has that kind of money would feel comfortable spending it on something like that. But there's no doubt that even though all the leagues that have been attempted since 1970 have failed, there's keeps being more people interested, and more people are interested. Seems like every decade, and so I can't rule out that somebody will get that idea, but it just seems really, to me, far-fetched that anybody will feel comfortable doing it anytime soon.
Well, Barnum is right? There's a sucker born every minute. All right, but that leads to my ultimate last question here, which is leads us to the doorstep of the NFL. So what do you think? I mean, the XFL specifically, probably not so much, but what do you, given all that's happened in the last number of weeks globally and in the pro sports world specifically, and now circling around the NFL, which, at least is going through the motions, albeit with a couple of nips and tucks of a, fall season with very little sort of change to it, at least as of now. What do you think this does to the NFL at some point? I mean, I made the argument earlier on. I think that a lot of sports, a lot of pro sports, we've been sort of at some peak levels, right? I'm a big soccer fan, but do we need 30 teams and growing in Major League Soccer? I don't know. I mean, we've got two supposedly multi-billion-dollar stadiums, supposedly going online this fall that are in many respects almost, incongruous to the new reality that we live in now. And I'm not saying that the NFL is in dire straits or ready to contract or any of that stuff, but I can't think the senior management and the owners of and the players and everybody involved with the NFL isn't looking at this little bit of a blip of the XFL and saying, geez, what if this is going to affect us? And what are your thoughts?
I think that, sports leagues like the NFL and others are now hugely incentivized to find a way to play their games, not just sit there and wait for the pandemic to be over and for physical distancing to be a thing of the past, but to find a way to play amidst that new normal, I guess. And to this point, obviously NBA hasn't figured it out. Major League Baseball, NHL, we're starting to see it in the Korean baseball a little bit, where they're back on the field. And that's, how is this going to affect the NFL? It will affect the NFL significantly if they can't innovate a way to play their season in some way, shape, or form between now and the start of next season. I guess is the best way to put it. And what that will look like, they need to think outside of the box. They need to, maybe these sports leagues, if the idea is that you can't play these games unless people are being tested all the time, then maybe these sports leagues need to heavily invest themselves in creating an environment in the country where everyone can get tested enough that they're not then pulling away tests that should go to people of more medical need. And so I think that's where the NFL is right now from a business standpoint is, they could get hurt significantly if they just sit back and wait for the all clear, so to speak, because who knows when or if they'll be an all clear. But they need to find a way, just like the Korean Baseball League is doing, just like Major League Baseball is trying to figure out, the NBA is trying to figure out, NHL is trying to figure out, MLS, golf, tennis. Everyone's trying to figure out how they can play their game safely and not have the revenue, drip dry. And so that's where the NFL is. It's not. I can't say like what it's going to do to them because I don't know how they're going to be able to whether they'll be able to respond. But if they can't figure out a way to do it, then you lose. The NFL is a $15 billion a year industry, and they can't play their season. Then you can do the math and figure out how much it's gonna hurt them.
And the collateral damage of television too, right? It's propping up a lot of broadcast television, right?
No doubt. There's that's part of it too, and something that has to be taken into consideration. And so that's why, like I say, if these leagues, they probably need to partner themselves, or I'm sure there's some people thinking about how they can do that. What do they need to do to ensure that NFL players can be tested enough to ensure the safety of them playing against each other in games, but not also creating the really bad public look of them taking more than their share of tests so that they can play their football games while people in medical crisis need them for much more important things. And so that's kind of where all the sports leagues to me are, is how can they manage that and what can they do to alleviate the scarcity that exists as it is now.
All right, our thanks to Kevin. And if you want to follow the football writings, that's the NFL, whatever occurs further with the XFL, all kinds of other great football writing. Kevin Seifert's stuff obviously is going to be found on ESPN.com or the ESPN app. And of course, you can follow Kevin on Twitter at his handle. That's at Seifert ESPN. That's Seifert, Seifert, and the letters ESPN, all one little truncated little handle there on Twitter. And we look forward to staying in touch with Kevin and obviously staying in touch with you as we continue to investigate what transpires further from this XFL demise. Certainly stories yet to come out, and we'll do our best to wrap them up in a nice bow in an upcoming episode when it warrants. And of course, if you want to keep in touch with what we're doing here, by all means, why don't you subscribe to the show if you haven't done that already? We're available wherever good podcasts are found, whatever your favorite podcast catcher or listener or device is. By all means, you'll find us there. Just search us up and subscribe. Find us on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. If you want to see all the old episodes, you can stream them there, or you can download them, do whatever you want with them. And of course, on the website, you'll find all of our social media feeds as well, but you can follow us directly from whatever your favorite social environment might be. For example, we're on Twitter, of course, too, at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. And you'll also find a little page devoted to us on Facebook, too, if you care to follow us there, you can do that. And let's see, you want to get email from us? You want a little weekly email newsletter? Well, we got you covered. We'll send you a little advance notice about what each week's episode or the coming week's episode that is going to be. You can just find the link conveniently there on our website and just sign up, and you'll be added to the list. And of course, if you want to send us an email directly, you can do that too. And we're at hello at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Yeah, hello at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Pretty easy to remember. And we'll hopefully do our best to answer your question or your comment or your request, whatever it might be. And we thank you for sending those emails. And we appreciate especially the increased volume of emails we've gotten over the last couple of weeks by many of you who have said that you enjoy listening to us. We appreciate that, especially now when you get a little bit bored or a little bit overwhelmed by what's going on in the world. And we give you a little bit of a respite. Well, that's our little contribution there, and we're happy to do it. And of course, we're We're happy for our production skills that come to us each and every week by way of a guy named Jerry Payne down there in Atlanta, Georgia. And he is the consummate professional, and Jerry Payne Audio Excellence is his firm. And if you need some podcast production help, he's probably the guy to be of help to you. Let us know if you're interested. We'll get you connected to Jerry. And we, of course, tip our, well, I know it's our baseball cap, right? But maybe our XFL logoed cap. There you go. His way, in his general direction. And our thanks, of course, for all his production help this and each and every week. And, of course, we thank you each and every week for listening, putting up with us. And we appreciate, again, all the commentary. And we look forward to seeing you next week. God knows what we're going to be talking about. But by golly, we'll do our best to be here. And hopefully you'll be here, too. Take care until next week. Bye-bye.
This is the future. This is not the past. This is the future. And the future moves fast. This is quicker, simpler. Rules, reform. This is your game. Safer. This is football. Reborn. This is gaming. And fantasy. This is padded. Roulette. Make a trade. Make a team. Make a move. Make a bet. This is fans above all. This is maximum action. Let's stall. More ball. Fewer infractions. This begins in 2020. The future is near. More access, more everyone, more everything here. This is our moment, our story to tell. This is history begun. This is